Please be seated. Good morning again. I am old enough to be really enslaved to all the old tales and stories and so on. And I'll share one with you. It goes way back in the ancient history of the church, way back in the 20th century, earlier in the 20th century. And that was a story that was told about a man who had been dean of the seminary that I attended, not at the time I was there, I'm not that old. But this was one of the tales that had survived. He was supposed to have been cantankerous would not be a charitable word. But let's say he was someone who was definite in his own mind about things. Does that sound fair enough? You can deal with that, okay? So back in those days, the students had no real outside entertainment, no television sets to watch, no sound systems, no MP3s, none of that, no cell phones or anything, no DVD players, even for those ancient of you, VCR players, none of these things. So they entertained themselves in that era by staging debates, usually on theological or scriptural subjects. And what they would do was choose a topic to debate on, and they would have two people draw straws to see whether they were speaking for a particular issue or topic, rather, or against it. And these were done usually informally after dinner. In good weather, they were done outside where the dormitories were. And people would gather around to listen to these. And one night in the evening, they had this one debate topic, and the dean was there listening, as he generally always was. And the subject, as I recall, was something like the validity of the virgin birth. And they drew straws, and one person argued for the doctrine of the virgin birth, as it's stated in the church's theology, and somebody else was arguing against it. Well, the next morning, after breakfast, the dean called the one who had drawn the straw to argue against the virgin birth into his office and began to berate him. Now, the highest compliment the dean had for the men in seminary at that time was that they were a boob. That was the highest compliment he could make about them. And so he began to berate this man and question his vocation, whether he ever even belonged there or not. And he seriously had to think about these things. And the man apparently had some courage, and he got a little defensive about it. And he said, "You're just picking on me because last night I was the one who had to argue against the virgin birth." And this apparently startled the dean a little bit from the stories that are told. And he sort of backed off a little bit. And he said, "You boob, I don't care what you say. It's what you do that counts, and you missed chapel this morning." So, that's kind of like walking the walk and talking the talk, isn't it? Kind of like that. So here is really what we're talking about in the gospel this morning. Jesus talks about this new kind of love that his disciples have to have one for another. And we're really, we're deceived by that a lot. Because we have sort of this sweet idea of love. We buy all these fancy cards that Hallmark and all the others put out, and they have all these lovely sentimental thoughts about love and everything in them. And we see love as an emotion. And we've seen all the films and everything where one looks deeply into another person's eye and declares his eternal love for this other person, or vice versa. And hopefully it's both meaning at the same time. But at any rate, we kind of get deceived by that, and we think of love in terms of an emotion. This is something I feel. And if I don't feel love for someone, obviously I don't have it, or if they don't feel love for me, obviously they don't love me. But love goes way beyond that. We can't be distracted by all those sentimental notions that are out there in the secular world. We have to look back to Jesus to see what love is really about. So he gets them in the upper room just for the Last Supper, and does not have a conversation about it. He gets to talk about it. This is the passage that we have from the gospel is kind of the beginning of what's called his last discourse to his disciples. And it takes up almost 3 chapters of St. John's Gospel. It is really lengthy. And go back and read it again if you haven't read it for a while. If you haven't read it since, sometime as long as last week, go back and read it again. And because we're going to be on that for a few weeks anyhow, as we have been in the gospel selections. But at any rate, Judas has just left to go out and do his deed of selling Jesus down the tube. And John the evangelist John, the person who has written this, is no fan of Judas. He takes every opportunity as you read St. John's Gospel, to classify Judas as the one who would betray him, as a thief, and all these other things. So there's a lot of editorial comments about Judas that John has to make. At any rate, Judas has just left. And Jesus then begins to talk to his disciples. And this whole discourse, I keep wanting to say conversation, but that's not right. But all of what Jesus has to say to his disciples there in the upper room is extraordinary. And if we absorb it and understand it, it's life-changing. And that's what he intended it to be. As he talks with them, he said, I give you, where I am going, you cannot come. And if the Holy Spirit wills it, I'll get back to that particular point rather than take too long. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. And there's that word love again. And we have all these different ideas, as I said, about what love is. But Jesus is talking about something else. And he says, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Now, I want to suggest that over 2,000 years of Christian history, we haven't always, we Christians, showed to the world that we had all this love for one another, have we? Things have been a little bit dicey. In most of our memories, we can remember the troubles in Northern Ireland, of Christians fighting against one another and taking each other's lives in the name of either Catholicism or Protestantism. And that's a disgrace. That's what the world sees. And this has a very ancient history, unfortunately, in the life of the Christian church. And this is not exhibiting what Jesus was talking about. So we have to go back and we have to look at Jesus' life and see what he was talking about. Well, he says to the disciples, where I'm going, you can't come. Where I'm going, you cannot come. Well, where he is going is death on the cross. And then resurrection into this new concept of life. He is the only one who can experience that. The disciples have experienced death, to be sure, and sometimes not very pleasant deaths like his. But nevertheless, they cannot follow him in that particular way because they don't have the same ministry and vocation that he has. And so, when he says this, then he says what it is that will be the meaning of the cross. And that meaning of the cross will be the love that they show the world that they have for each other. And through them, the love that they have for the world. The kind of love that Jesus has, which he hands over to them, is the kind that puts him on the cross. That has him nailed to the cross as a way of showing forth this love in the world. Because when they see him go to the cross, the thing they don't know, because they haven't been listening, is that the cross is not going to defeat him. They don't understand that because, as I said, they haven't been listening. How many times have we said to our children and our grandchildren, are you listening to me? Does that sound like a familiar phrase? Are you listening to me? And my granddaughter's been with us this weekend, and she is a wonderful child. But she gets into her books. And I heard my wife say, are you listening to me? And she said, oh yeah. And I refrained myself and didn't say, oh yeah, well, what did she say? Well, what do you mean kind? We haven't seen her for a long time. So anyway. So